Hey, so it's week 4. Should be just about done with the book. We'll be looking at the Cold War, specifically Vietnam and Korea, during this week. So what we'll look at are a few different sources. We're going to look at a Chinese life. This is an autobiography. The man who wrote this was in China during the Cultural Revolution, grew up through all that, and he's lived to see China become what it is now, which is very, very different than where he thought it was going to be. The part we're going to look at specifically is when he was a little kid and dealing with this world of the Cold War heating up with soldiers in the country right next door and what this meant for his life. Voices from Korea, this is an awesome book. It's not a graphic novel, but it's easy to implement this into your classes if you like. It's short pieces written by people on both sides of the Korean conflict. I believe there's 3 sections we'll be looking at. Showa, if you're not familiar with Showa, it's a massive, massive book series. Each book in the series is about yay thick, all graphic novels, and they cover Emperor Showa's time and what Japan went through and things like that. The artwork might look pretty familiar to you. What we'll look at in the Showa series is what the fighting in Vietnam and Korea, what kind of effect this had on Japan. Then there's Vietnam America. Pretty interesting book, although if you decide to use this graphic novel in your class, just be careful. There's cussing and violence in here. The book, it's about a person of Vietnamese descent who goes back to Vietnam with his dad because of a funeral, and then he learns his dad's story and puts that into the graphic novel. Great art in this, although sometimes the writing can be a little hard to read. I've had some students complain about that. But you'll be looking at some sections of kind of what life was like there. And then we've got some poems. I can't remember if it's 3 or 4 poems I've got pulled out for you, including one from Ho Chi Minh himself. Alright, so here's like the 10-cent definition of the Korean War, 10-cent tour, as well as the Vietnamese War coming up. So feel free to skip this unless you want a quick refresher course. Obviously, I'm not going to do them justice, but this is just meant to be just a real quick thing. If you have any specific questions, feel free to contact me. So here it starts, 1950, communist troops invade from the north. America and various allies eventually push back, starting off, sorry about that. At first, the American troops and the Allied troops are in kind of a defensive campaign, and then they decide to start pushing back. They push into North Korea. That's going to trigger China to get even more involved than it was before. A lot of casualties during this war, more than half of which are going to be civilians. It's not a very long war, as you can see, about 3 years. There's going to be a lot of Americans that are wounded or killed during this war. A little piece of trivia for you, if you're a fan of MASH, it's one of the few shows that kind of focuses around the Korean War. The show ran for longer than the war actually ran, so kind of fun bit of trivia, I guess. 1953, the war's over. The end result, not much changed. The South gets, I forget how much, but like 1,000 square miles more. I mean, not much more land, and now there's a demilitarized zone. One thing that is of note is that officially the Korean nations are still at war. CNN just did a news story on April 27th. Kim Jong-un crossed the border and was talking about officially ending the war. So while we don't really talk about it here much in the United States, it's still something that gets brought up in other countries. All right, your 10-cent retelling the Vietnam War. 1900s, Vietnam belongs to France. It's a colonial holding. World War II happens. the French more or less lose control of most of Vietnam. The Japanese come in. Ho Chi Minh starts up the Viet Minh, and they're fighting not just the Japanese, but they're fighting the French and anyone else who would keep Vietnam as a holding. They want Vietnam for the Vietnamese people. He looks at China and the Soviet Union, these countries that had kind of the communist revolution, and uses that as his template for how to do things. During the Cold War, this is going to cause some blowback from countries like the United States. Alright, so the French are fighting Ho Chi Minh's forces. French not really doing so great, especially after World War II. They're not in a position to really dedicate the manpower, dedicate the funds, the resources, all that stuff. So they come to a peace treaty. They split Vietnam into more or less two countries. Ho Chi Minh is in charge of the north, and then the president of the south is backed by the French, Emperor Bao. In 1955, the U.S. starts sending advisors, money, supplies, things like that into Vietnam to help the leaders of South Vietnam. Eventually, this leads to sending in some troops, and then some more troops, and then more troops, and more, and 20 years later, a lot of people are dead, and the war doesn't end until the North Vietnamese army conquers all of Vietnam. So there's your quick reminder of the Vietnam War and the Korean conflict, the Korean police action, whatever you prefer to call it. Like I said, any questions? Just ask.